Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Making Sense, the flagship podcast of The Common Sense. On the show, we bring together a panel of brilliant South Africans across the globe to unpack the most important and pressing stories of the week. My name is Rain Opperman, and I'll be standing in for Gabriel Makin today, and I'm really thrilled to be hosting. We have such an excellent show. We have a really long lineup. We'll be discussing the Roedean controversy, Keir Starmer's troubles in the UK, South Africa's energy challenges, shifts within the DA and policy, ANC's concerns over Iran, and then, if there's time, we'll also talk about China's trade pact with South Africa. Joining me on the panel today, we have James Myburg, who's the director of the Bremen Democracy Research Group, based in Germany. We have Richard Tren, who's director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, based in Washington, D.C. And then I have Simon Lincoln Reeder, who's our international and markets correspondent, had a long stint in the financial services sector in the UK, typically joins us from the UK in London, but he'll now be joining from California. And then lastly, we have Frans Cronje, who is the editor of The Common Sense, and he is the founder of Frans Cronje Private Clients. So let's dive right in. Up first, I want to talk about the Roedean controversy. It's a really seriously unfortunate situation that happened between Roedean and King's David's, who are two elite Johannesburg high schools. The one is Anglican and the other one is Jewish. And it came out that some members of the Roedean community did not want their pupils to compete against King David in a tennis fixture because they are Jewish. So, Richard, if you could kindly unpack the situation to us and just explain what happened this week.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, and for international listeners, Roedean School is one of South Africa's most prestigious girls-only private schools. It was, as you said, an Anglican school. It was actually set up as a sister school. There's a Roedean in Brighton in the UK. And so Roedean South Africa was set up probably in the early 1900s, I think, as an offshoot of that school, and has for many years been one of South Africa's most prestigious schools. It was one of those schools, like a lot of other private schools, during the years of apartheid that opened up to accepting Black and Indian students, and was a kind of diverse and tolerant school in an old Anglican tradition. And how things have changed. As you mentioned, and the Common Sense has done some very good reporting on this, how the children from King David came to play a tennis match and were turned away, given an excuse to say that the Roedean girls were at some sort of geography class or doing something else and they couldn't play. This all turns out to be a lie, and we know this because of recorded conversations between the heads of both schools, in which the head of Roedean admits that the parents of the children at Roedean do not want to play Jewish children, and therefore they cancelled this tennis match. And this is an important issue, because this is now arriving in South Africa. There's the same kinds of bigotry we've seen at schools and universities in the United States. We've seen this in the UK. It seems there is a sort of 1930s feel to this whole thing now. The permission has been granted to allow people to express this simmering, this hatred, this bigotry that's been simmering under the surface. Now suddenly the permission slip has been given, and you are allowed to openly express bigotries that once were, people would be more reluctant to express. This should lead to the resignation, I think, of the board of Roedean School. This is totally unacceptable, as it had led to the resignations and severe consequences for the leaders of universities in the United States that allowed such bigotry and hatred to exist. And I'll just say one other thing. The Roedean has been backpedaling and making excuses and frankly being dishonest about this putting out a statement today talking about how important diversity is for their school. And like a lot of these statements, all these institutions love to talk about diversity that is only skin deep. They love the diversity that we all look like different colors, but they require absolute conformity when it comes to ideas. And now it sees again among the sort of the upper class educated people that that conformity when it comes to Jew hatred and anti-Zionism, which is the same thing. That's one thing that's allowed, and they're allowed to get away with it. And kudos to the free press for doing such great reporting and calling out this bigotry. But there are others there that know more about this than I do. So let me hand over to France and Simon.
Thanks, Richard. Simon, let's take your question first.
Well, it's more of a comment, Richard. I spent the last week in Johannesburg, 2 very happy days, I might add, at the Common Sense. And what I noticed socially in the prosperous suburbs, Westcliff, Saxonwold, speaking to a lot of people, private equity people, lawyers, and so on, is a noticeable shift in acceleration in anti-Israel and subsequently anti-Jew talk. More so, I lived in Johannesburg for 13 very happy years. I never encountered the level that I encountered in a few days last week. That section of society is becoming English, becoming UK. This is what they talk about in the UK now. It's very dangerous, and I don't even know if people are aware of it. I genuinely think that the tide has taken them along, and it's become modish. It's become a fad to be anti-Israel. But it's very, very worrying. And as I said, I'd never seen it to the extent that I did in a few days last week. So worrying.
Yes, I think you're right to point out England, and I actually happen to be in the UK at the moment, even though my normal home is in Washington DC. And I think I wrote about this for a little piece in the Common Press, the Common Sense, a little while ago. About not long after October 7th, I went down to the little church in my parents' town, and there was a sort of installation in front of the altar, and there was all sorts of broken concrete and broken, barbed wire, and and I asked the vicar there. I said, "What's this about?" And he said, "Oh, it's our installation to remember the victims of Gaza." And I said, well, at that point, there were about 250 hostages being held. This was not long after October 7th. And I said, is there anything for the hostages that are being held, that are being tortured in tunnels? And he looked at me completely befuddled, as though, what a ridiculous question. Why would we do something about that? Let's just focus on the supposed children. And I get to this, women and children. Let's get to that point in a little bit. That are the victims of Israeli aggression, and not the people that started a war and that continue to perpetuate it. It's a very twisted world now, and the Anglican Church and clearly the Anglican schools, their moral compass is completely skewed.
In addition to that, Richard, don't you think it's extremely concerning that the sort of rhetoric that we've seen in the universities abroad in the US has now seeped into the high school level in South Africa? Can you speak to the sort of similarities in the US and here, and how
Yes.
it's come to this level?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great, we're seeing the success of the Qatar-led and other, malevolent actors, their actions in demonizing Israel and in promoting Jew hatred. We're seeing this come out because all you needed was the sort of twisting of words, the use of the word genocide, the use of the word colonialist. These are old sort of Soviet tactics where you start perverting the language and words stop meaning anything. And as many brainier people than me have pointed out, for evil to happen, you need to convince people that they're doing the right thing. These children probably think they're doing the right thing because they've been convinced, they've been lied to, that there is a genocide going on, and therefore, and that the all-powerful international Jew is behind it. Therefore, they are on the side of the angels. This is how you get great evils to take place, and it starts with this kind of thing. And it's as you're quite right, it's widespread in the United States. It happened while Hamas was busy still attacking, still on Israeli land, attacking and murdering and raping. People were coming out praising them and condemning Israel and the Jews. This is a phenomenal success of the groups, like I said, like Qatar, and those anti-Western forces that seek to destroy Western civilization. I'm sorry if I'm sounding a little hyperbolic, but I think this is what's going on. And it starts with perverting language and poisoning the minds of children so they cannot tell right from wrong.
Simon?
Yeah, I think Richard's raised a very interesting point there. The Church of England, it's been in steady decline since 2020. Now, it comes up with this idea that it needs to start owning up to its slavery links back then. In every single church you find the pride flag and then a little memo to George Floyd, the ghost of George Floyd. And this becomes very off-putting to people who've just come out of a lockdown in which they've been barred from attending spiritual comfort in the church. This decline of this angle the church has gone has recently seen the Church of England being awarded £750,000 to promote anti-racial theory in its sermons and lectures. It's all part of the same process. And I wonder, Rich, just how much of an effect that is having on the broader thing. So when I speak about the middle class in Johannesburg, this prosperous set of people, presumably some of whom go to church, presumably some of whom follow the Archbishop of Canterbury and so on, maybe that too is an indirect is indirectly fomenting this anti-Jewish hatred. Back to you, Rainer.
Yeah. I'm sure you're right about that, and how quick they are to forget. They only focus on whatever supposed Anglican church involvement in slavery, forgetting that William Wilberforce, that great anti-slavery campaigner, who was an evangelical Anglican himself. It was the Anglican Church and the missionaries that ended slavery that had been a constant of human history. Every community enslaved. One civilization ends it, led by the Anglican Church. That we're all supposed to forget. Like I said, this is a moral compass that is severely skewed, we cannot forgive them for what they've done here, and we should hold them to account. I mentioned just briefly earlier the business about women and children. All you'll ever hear from these campaigners is how Israel has been targeting women and children. What they don't want to say is that Hamas has just announced that it's going to be paying compensation to the families of the 50,000 Hamas operatives that were killed by Israel during the war, out of the 70,000. Suddenly, so what's going on there? This once again exposes the lie that these people have been told, and it's been exposed by Hamas. This was a just war committed in a way unprecedented in human history. No army has ever managed to conduct an urban war with such low civilian casualties. We should be praising Israel. Instead, these moral midgets, these twisted morons, are coming out the opposite. We, like I said, kudos to the common press for its great reporting on this.
France.
It's very good of you, Richard, to confuse us with Barry Weiss's free press. It's a great compliment. I feel that we're achieving something good here by you. Maybe we should be the common press. We can do well out of that. I think in one of the thoughts, Rainer, that struck me when I first heard of this, and many of us here went to these schools. I mean, we didn't go to Roedean school, and but we were very close.
Don't just use my gender there, France, please.
Yeah, well, yeah, many of us went. So we know these places, and what struck me was what did those Jewish girls think? Because they would have gone to Roedean in a little bus, and they would have got out as all of us did when we were growing up with their tennis rackets and whatever, and they would have walked across the lawns, they would have gotten to the tennis courts. And when they got there, they would have started to realize what was happening. And their teacher would have had to tell them, you know, this is what's happened. You've got to get back on the bus and go home. And what do you think they thought as they were going home about what had happened? Just because they were Jewish, that they'd gone home without, they would have had to get home, they would have had to tell their parents, you know, so how was your day? They said, oh, well, you know, this happened to us. I mean, this is 1930s. Absolutely frightening. And it is exactly what you've described it as. This complete perversion of the values the Anglican Church once held. It's allowed on this campus. There's an important event here that I think in the later serious sort of diagnoses of what happened, because at this time it appears Roedean is doubling down and justifying its behavior, which is even more frightening. The damage to that school's legacy and reputation might be permanent. Is in 2023, there's an investigative author by the name of Richard Wilkinson, who's a very brave guy, a very good person. And Richard did a piece or a series of pieces, I think, on Roedean having commissioned a group, I think called Heart, to provide what I think Roedean called holistic Islamic education to the girls at the school. But Heart's social media and communications of the time, in fact, its branding was a paraglider in reference to the paragliders that had ferried the terrorists to slaughter the Jews on October the 7th. Roedean saw fit to engage with this group, describe it as providing holistic Islamic education. And some of the texts that Heart was putting out that, you know, Richard looked at and was blood-curdling incitement to violence against Jews. And that's a very important data point in explaining what's happened here, I think, because it makes it unlikely to sustain the argument later on that this was some freak, tangential, once-off event, something that came out of the blue that had was foisted upon the school from outside forces the school had nothing to do with, would in fact suggest that it was the opposite, that this was enabled by the school itself, and that the consequences have now grown big on it, and it's in the middle of this ballooning scandal, this most abhorrent 1930s behavior. And it's a pattern of radicalization, stigmatization, that you position Jews as the other in order that society loses the ability to empathize with them, so that you then make them vulnerable to attacks. And the attacks can be verbal, and they can be exclusionary, and they can later be violent. And our friend Benji Shulman, who runs the Middle East Africa Research Institute, asked him for some thoughts on how he sees this and how serious it is. And I mean, he really makes you understand, because he says, look, it's the stigmatization that leads to this is the very thing that later leads to jihad and violence. And that is what the school has blundered into. And and seemingly oblivious, continues to blunder ever deeper.
Thank you, Franz. Richard, over to you.
Sorry, just want to make one other quick point. And Raina, you mentioned what's happening in the States, and we just had the Super Bowl, and there was a controversial advertisement taken out by Robert Kraft, who's the owner of the Patriots that was playing the Seattle Seahawks. And during and Robert Kraft is Jewish, and during the Super Bowl, he took out an anti-Semitism ad that ran during the Super Bowl, and this has become quite controversial. And I'll just give you a very brief synopsis of what happened. So this is the advertisement is of a school, a teenage boy going through school that gets jeered and gets pushed around a bit, and he takes off his backpack to put it in his locker, and he sees that somebody has put a post-it note saying "Dirty Jew" on the back of his backpack, and then walks up to him. This taller, older black kid comes up to him and puts his arm around him and covers that post-it note with a blue sticker. And this is supposed to be the blue sticker against anti-Semitism, and saying, don't worry, ignore them, you'll be okay, coming to his aid. The reason this has been, and I think this is available on YouTube for anybody to watch, but there's been a bunch of AI alternative versions of this advertisement. And it's been roundly rejected by large portions of the Jewish community in America, saying, we're not the victims here. Stop treating us like we are the cowering Jew on bended knee being pushed around by the bullies, only to be rescued by the older, bigger guy. And there are a couple of alternatives. One is that this kid grows a stiff spine, makes Aliyah, joins the IDF, fights for his people, and starts to contribute to Israel, the most successful democracy with the fastest growing economy and a growing population in the region. Another alternative is that he puts his head down, he starts studying, he becomes a world leading scientist, and eventually saves the lives because of his scientific research from a brain tumor of one of the guys that stuck the sticker on. And I think this is the right approach. Stop apologizing, demand that these people stop this, defend yourself, and look at how Israel has come out of this horrific war that was launched against them. They've come out stronger, and I think this is the answer. And this is why we have to take a very strong stance, unapologetic stance against Roedean and these perverts that are doing this, and stand up against this hatred and stop. Roedean can apologize, but the answer really is for the King David's girls and boys to become the best in their fields and to succeed, as Jews everywhere in the world have.
Thank you, Richard. I would encourage our listeners to go to the website and read the reporting that the Common Sense did on this issue this week. It is truly excellent, in my opinion. We uncovered a recording between senior officials at both of the schools where Roedean is caught in the lie. So definitely head over to our website. I'm going to head over to our next topic. I'm going to delve into the DA and John Steenhuisen, who will not be standing again as leader of the DA, and what this leadership void will now mean for the DA. So, James, with Steenhuisen's departure, there's been this growing media pressure that the DA should return to older race-based policies. I know they've sort of oscillated between supporting and rejecting race-based policies. So can you please just briefly explain what is going on here?
Yeah, I think the context to remember is the DA is in a very sort of one of those situations where things can go wrong for them, or they can finally make the breakthrough into the black electorate that they've into a much broader constituency that they've long sort of hoped to do, and that their supporters have actually long wanted them to do. But for a long time, there's been this racial moat that, there's been a cycle going back many, many years of, polling in between elections that show a section of moderate black voters are very open to the DA. But by the time it gets to the election, the ANC puts its, racial propaganda on steroids, and at least and the media works on that for them as well, and the black voters can't make that final step for actually voting for this minority-based party. But we, with the government of national unity, the DA's doesn't have much leverage there, I think, which is clear because the ANC is sort of half-minded to blow it up at any point. But the DA ministers, as we've discussed, can show, they can govern well. This FMD is a blot on that, unfortunately, but setting that aside. And it shows that this isn't that this propaganda about the DA wanting to bring back apartheid is nonsense and has always been nonsense. But it puts you in a very difficult position, because if you're just seen as ANC light, then you also, that takes away any reason for voters to want to vote for you, and it can lead to you eventually imploding, which is the real threat. So that's the situation. that they're in currently. And, to go back many years is, when the ANC took power in the mid-90s, what they wanted was a sort of national consensus, basically saying we set our ideology is unquestionable, and we want a pliant media that supports it, and we want political opposition that also supports it. So in a sense, the East German model, where opposition parties were allowed to exist, but they had to support the socialist agenda of the ruling party. And what happened in the second half of the 90s is essentially the English media was brought to heel. Quite how that was done is an untold story, but from being very liberal-minded in the early 90s, by about 1997, it was totally, compliant with the ANC's, ideological program of transformation. The DA actually fought back against that and was attacked by not just by the ANC, but by this new English media at the time. And that's how it built up, created the space for opposition. So it's had this history of opposition to the ANC's racial agenda, but it's always been under a lot of pressure from this, pro-ANC media to sort of, submit ideologically. And there have been times where it's fought back very effectively, and times, especially during Musi Maimani's leadership of the party, where it began sort of sliding into support of that ideology, and we've discussed that previously, and all of that. So, but to give John Steenhuisen a lot of credit, even if his current situation is not the ideal one, he actually moved the DA back to its historic roots of liberalism and opposition to systemic racial discrimination, which it sustained under apartheid, and which it sustained for the most part, with a few wobbles along the way under ANC rule. But whenever there's a change of leadership, there's the media will start one of these pressure campaigns on the DA to make it, to sort of test it ideologically, and to try and get it to support the ANC's racial program, even though everyone in South Africa can see that program has been the consequences of that program in terms of the collapsed state capacity, the collapsed state-owned enterprises, the low economic growth have been a disaster. There's still this element within the media that sort of wants ideological compliance, and you can see it, or how this question is rephrased. If you oppose this racial project of the ANC, then you're opposed to redress. It's always described as redress. It's never these intellectuals who've supported this program, which have had horrific consequences, across the board in South Africa. I mean, it's pushed up black unemployment to about almost 50%. They never talk about the redress they're willing to offer for supporting very destructive policies, which have caused a lot of harm. But anyway, so you get the sense that there's a new leader coming in. We're going to test him. We're going to see if we can make him buy into our racial program again. And so the DA is under pressure again on this. Now, in the circumstances, it's very it holds a lot of risks for the DA, because firstly, ordinary voters just want good governance. And if you buy into this racial project, then you're cutting your legs off, because you can't deliver good governance without appointing people on the basis of merit, allocating tenders on the basis of the capacity of the companies to do the work, bringing in investment, and all that sort of thing. So we're also in the situation where the DA has to distinguish itself, because the danger of being in the government of national unity is that you look like an ANC lackey, or you've sold out to the ANC. So outside of the GNU, you have to, show very clearly that you are ideologically distinct from the ANC. So if you start, positioning yourself as ANC light, as a large part of the media always wants the DA to do, then again, people will start asking, why should we vote for these people? Because they're not offering a serious alternative. And that also, yeah. So that's basically the situation as I would describe it. But if other people want to come in here, they're welcome to.
Thanks, James. I think you've sort of placed the risks very clearly. Is there anybody that would like to hone in on France? Over to you.
I might just go to here because it's opportune to something you might have had us talk about later, but it fits. John Steenhuisen's departure at practice as DA leader was quite sudden, and the DA have reasons for that, which are fine, but it is risky to do something suddenly and quickly. And we've been thinking a bit about where to now for the DA, and it's emerging, but one way of thinking about it is these two binary results, one of which for them would be desirable, the other that wouldn't. So let's start with the one that wouldn't be, that they've moved very suddenly on John Steenhuisen and are now going to get into, this is the negative chain of events. It's not a forecast, just setting it out. This is the negative chain that they must avoid. They moved suddenly on John Steenhuisen, and now they're going to get into a leadership contest ahead of April. And for whatever reason, let's say that leadership contest turns very nasty and a little bit racial. Let's say it's and the media plays that up. And at the same time, John Steenhuisen now has been put in the interesting position where he owes his career to the head of the ANC. He's no longer the DA guy, he's cabinet minister now. Cyril Ramaphosa is the head of the ANC, and control over what happens to him. Let's say that in the course of this, so now you've had this nasty leadership race, and let's say Mr. Ramaphosa decides that John's handling of foot and mouth hasn't been good enough, and John's dismissed from the cabinet. He now doesn't have a job. Looks back at the DA and all sorts of tensions emerge there again. Let's at the same time, Mr. Ramaphosa has privately figured out how to fix foot and mouth disease. And he has put in place a new minister, perhaps of his party or perhaps somewhere else, a Freedom Front or so, who actually gets it right quite quickly. And this foot and mouth crisis has done damage in the DA and to its reputation, and that someone else fixes it after John's firing does even more damage. Let's say the new leader of the DA is Jordan Hill-Lewis, who's been running Cape Town, and he's now got to split his attention between the Cape, which is a big job in itself, and the National Party and the national government and its policies at this point of tension and crisis. And the DA should prevail in Cape Town in the local government election, likely will, and in the province in 2029, but that's not assured, and its vote count is in fact a bit flat, and it faces a serious challenge from Gayton McKenzie and the PA. So let's say Jordan's attention's a bit distracted, and the DA gets a fright in the Cape. And this will cause a bit of a panicky reaction in the party. What the hell's happening here? This was our stronghold, and now there's a hole in the bottom of the party, perhaps. It's not working so well, and confidence in us isn't great. And let's say in the aftermath of that, the ANC elects Patrice Motsepe as its next leader. And Mr. Motsepe is a man of stature, and he comes about and he says, look, I'm a serious guy. I've been above all this politics of recent years. The ANC hasn't performed well. The DA hasn't, look at foot and mouth disease, it's catastrophe where they were in government. And the GNU's got all tense, and I'm the guy, and I'll fix this. And the DA's bled support now to the Freedom Front and the PA. You might very easily get an election result in 2029 where the ANC gets 45, the DA goes to under 20, and the ANC forms a government with the Freedom Front and the PA together, or in order to evade MK and the EFF, and the DA's chance is gone. This is not our forecast, but this is a chain of events to think through. The flip side of it, the punching through, as James puts it, is that the DA has now made the decision on John, and Hill-Lewis becomes the next leader, and it's a smooth, decent contest. No racial animosities or so on are introduced or or claims that it's now time for the party to transform itself. Why is it getting another white leader? When will it embrace BE? Or all of that gets smoothly through. Zille knocks it out the park in Johannesburg. The DA rivals the ANC in all the serious municipal districts in the country and does well. Foot and mouth disease is well handled because John Steenhuisen has done what I think is the right thing. Give private actors real control over what's going on the ground. And the ANC elect someone other than Mr. Motsepe as its next leader. In that chain of events, you can have a 2029 election where the DA perhaps goes to 30 something. And maybe let's make these two totally binary options, it might get more in the 30s than the ANC gets, which is also in the 30s, and it's a senior partner potentially in the government. And so the DA has come to, with the departure of John, to quite an important potential fork in the road here. And the decisions that it takes now and how it takes those and thinks through those decisions are going to determine that, you mustn't think of these things, I think, on the spur of the moment. You must know ahead of time exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to do it to realize the upsides and avoid the downsides. And it's actually quite a perilous moment that has arrived for the DA. Rona.
Yeah, Frans, just for those of us who are not living in South Africa and are maybe a little bit distant from this, if Gordon Hill-Lewis is elected the leader, how important is it for the future of the DA that he is not actually a sitting member of parliament? I'm right about that. He's the mayor of the Cape Town, right? He's not important. Is it better to have someone who's in parliament to lead the party, or does that not matter these days?
No, I don't think so. Parliament's not what it used to be. I mean, it literally is a smoking ruin. I was there.
Okay.
And it's conducted in a tent next to what used to be the Parliament. You really should rebuild Parliament very, very, very fast. If I was in charge, yes, I'd have rebuilt Parliament quickly so we could go back inside. And I don't think it's that important. And I don't think, even in America, Congress is there, but executive decisions have become such a thing.
Yes.
I think the important thing is that the leader of the DA is not in the government. That's important, because then it's possible, the DA has wrestled with this choice since GNU, are we in the government or are we the opposition? You don't have to make that choice. You can claim, and nor does the ANC, frankly, these days. It's not, you can claim successes for what's gone well in the government, and you can bulk up the ability of Parliament to go after your opponents when things don't go well in the country or the government. So I think a strengthening and bulking up of parliamentary abilities, which might have been slightly neutered over the last 18 months on the DA side, just bulking up, making that really strong, making the clear ideological distinction between the parties, which I totally agree with James, is critical. That can be done, and so the thing really is the DA leader outside of the government. That's the important thing, and I imagine that might be now the decision that they take.
Frans, the DA is clearly at an inflection point. You might have answered this comprehensively already, but what advice would you have for the DA as they navigate these turbulent waters?
I'm always wary of that question because, the man in the arena is true. They're there and they do it, and anyone that would actually go to Parliament and be a politician. South Africa's got a dearth of skills. The DA's best people, or South Africa's best politicians broadly, could do very well in the private sector and make more money and frankly have a better time. So I always try and say that you should be very grateful that they're very high caliber people that actually go and do this, but it's hard. And you get a lot of abuse, and you don't get as well paid as you would be in the private sector, and all of that. But so I'm wary of. We'd offer thoughts on how we think about it if people are interested in those. But I'd say you need the highest caliber thinking and strategists around you now to plot step by step the strategy and the tactics, so that in the arena, the spur of the moment, you've thought through action, reaction, and counter-reaction, so that you're taking wise and shrewd strategic decisions in pursuit of a very long-term, very clear set of objectives. And the overall depth of thinking across South Africa's political parties is not always what it should be. And that would be my advice.
Yeah, I just to sort of, I suppose, repeat a bit, is obviously the local government elections are absolutely critical. And it's also critical for the DA in Cape Town, because it's, majority might come under threat there. So it has to come out of those elections as the real alternative to failed ANC rule. So that would be the short-term objective. I think Jordan Hill-Lewis, if he's elected, is a very, very naturally talented politician. And it's certainly conceivable in that sense that he could achieve more through natural political talent than John Steenhuisen could, who clearly had his limitations. So that's the only thing I would add to those points.
Thank you, James. I'm going to move on now to the UK and to Simon. So Keir Starmer is facing mounting calls to resign, and this follows revelations that Lord Mandelson, which was Starmer's pick to be ambassador to the United States, had closer ties to Jeffrey Epstein that was previously understood. And so that has really triggered a fallout and a wave of exits, high-level exits from Downing Street. So, Simon, Keir Starmer is now the most unpopular British Prime Minister on record. How did we get here?
Well, Keir Starmer is squatting in Downing Street, and no one likes a squatter. It's like old fish. After 3 days, it starts getting a bit off-putting. And so we're sort of a day in. He was saved by his loyalists at the 11th hour. He threatened them with a bond market crisis, which is what happened to Liz Truss. He's now, his hands, his fate lie in the hands of people that are going to want their own things, and that's the cabinet, all of whom are the proponents of the Blairite consensus. But to answer your question, let's just go to Mandelson first and then Starmer, because I think that wraps it up. In December 2024, we're all sitting along and it gets announced that Peter Mandelson has been appointed the United Kingdom's ambassador to the United States. Now, there are two ways of looking at this. The first is that it's a shrewd move, because Mandelson, for all his darkness, and there's plenty of that, he's a very skilled trade negotiator. Remember, the European Union sent Mandelson to the World Trade Organization to negotiate because he gets stuff done. The second way to look at it was that so low was the opinion of Donald Trump within Downing Street that they thought that they would send in an alley cat to deal with another alley cat. And that was not very flattering. That's how the Americans interpreted it, especially Trump's campaign manager at the time. But the country was incredibly perplexed by this, because Mandelson is a very dark figure who was the architect of something called New Labour, which was responsible for something called the Blairite consensus. Now, before he was appointed, the story is that he was vetted by the security services. This is Mandelson being appointed as ambassador to the United States. And they said, well, okay, he's slightly dark, he is a slippery fellow, and he was friends with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, there are photographs that reveal his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein involved the two of them going on shopping trips to St. Bart's to buy belts together. So you want to go buy a belt with a guy, or you want to wish him a happy birthday, and you're caught as he's blowing out candles sitting next to him. So Mandelson goes, well, actually, I wasn't as close to him as everyone suspects, and I am disgusted with Jeffrey Epstein, and I wish I'd never met him. So that goes ahead. Mandelson is mandated to secure a 0% tariff trade agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom. That's what he is told to do. Trump's in no mood to give that, so he imposes 10%, which is less than the European Union, and for that matter, South Africa, but it is still going to affect the British economy slightly. Then what happens next is very interesting. Under pressure, the Department of Justice in the US 2 weeks ago is forced to release thousands of new of information involving Jeffrey Epstein's correspondence. And what happens then is that it is revealed that his relationship with Peter Mandelson is much more extensive than was initially believed and Mandelson claimed. Let me just take a step backward. Mandelson was sacked as ambassador in September with the first the first tranche of information. This new tranche looks to some pretty hairy stuff. And by hairy, I mean that Peter Mandelson, whilst he was in Downing Street, for the third or the fourth time, however many times he's been down, he's come back up every time more powerful than he was previously. This time, he's selling market-sensitive information or just delivering it to Jeffrey Epstein. This causes an enormous rupture in the UK government. And on Sunday, Morgan McSweeney, who is Keir Starmer's chief of staff, resigns. But our audience should take this all into consideration. Keir Starmer's government is Morgan McSweeney's government. And Morgan McSweeney's government is actually Peter Mandelson's government. So whilst Mandelson hasn't, irrespective of his ambassadorial status up until September last year, hasn't been an official in the Starmer administration, he's been pulling the strings. And he's been ensuring that Morgan McSweeney does the work necessary to keep Keir Starmer in power. And this is a continuation of the Blairite consensus, which started in 1997 and which I've written for France about and hopefully will be published this week. What the Blairite consensus is something that can't be filled within the space of a single podcast, because it's probably one of the most pernicious political theories that have ever been applied in the English-speaking world. And it has resulted in a fractured society, and it looks to now be nearing its end. It almost came to an end in 2017 when Jeremy Corbyn, who's actually a left-wing guy, for all that's wrong with him, he is ideologically left on every single point that you can imagine. And subsequently, at that point, when Jeremy Corbyn challenged that 2017 general election and lost by a hair's breadth, Mandelson emerged again to groom McSweeney, and McSweeney in turn chose the most unimaginative, boring, and indecisive candidate in Labour's history, which is Keir Starmer. And the reason why, Rainer, Keir Starmer is so unpopular is because he does not possess political instincts. He is, by his own admission, he doesn't read books, and he even claims not to dream. He's a human rights lawyer who's got a very strange view on the world, and the only emotion he ever seems to have ever demonstrated was to save death row inmates from the electric chair. Got very animated then when he's in that situation. He's very, very lively at that point. But otherwise, we can only assume that through Mandelson and McSweeney, this guy is continuity Blair, and New Labour, this project. And I don't know how to explain to my fellow panelists here today what New Labour was. All I can say it's maybe this, okay? It's a white guy looking at another white guy and calling him racist, then having to apologize and say it was taken out of context in the hope that one day you get a job at BlackRock that pays you £500,000 for 2 days work a week. I think that's probably about as close to New Labour as you get. There was very little Labour about it. It was a talk left, walk right, poach very bad ideas from both sides, poach bad social ideas from the left and bad economic ones from the right, and confuse people and befuddle them. And I think it's an important point to finish up on here, is that if you look at how fractured British society is, and I'm not sure Richard's seen it, he's in England at the moment, but it's becoming more fractured. And it's almost as if there's been a curse. A country has been thrust into war from the inside, that people hate each other and they hate their history, and they think that everything that they stand for is bigoted. And New Labour must stick its hand up, because if it does, if the worst comes to the worst, then they'll have to look at where politics went so wrong. And I think that you could do worse than look at New Labour, Peter Mandelson's influence, and the product of Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Simon. And just to reiterate that McSweeney is the Chief of Staff.
Correct. Former Chief of Staff. Resigned on Sunday.
Former, yes. He's resigned. Frans, over to you.
I think, Simon, you said so much about the Blairite consensus and New Labour, but I think we actually have to explain it better for people who don't follow these things closely or have the recollection. I mean, in a sort of, I don't know how you, an impossible consensus between Thatcherite capitalism and socialism that created impossible contradictions and confusions later at the heart of the British government, the consequences of which are still rolling through British society today.
I think that's very much a start. And as I said, it's a confusing thing, but I think it was made even more confusing by the popularity with which it was initially received. And if you remember those early Blair years, there was, and we're talking 1997 here, there was this theme called Cool Britannia. You had Oasis going to visit Downing Street. You had Tony Blair appearing as this hip, young, edgy prime minister who was void of the stodgy chumminess that the Conservatives had, in both conservative and conservative West. So it was a new style of politics, and the country lapped it up. And the point that I'll make for France is that it was really, really popular. If you think how popular it survived the Iraq War, the illegal invasion of a sovereign nation based on false information. In 2005, they went to the polls. Blair lost only 8 points off his 1997 landslide. It was incredibly well received. France is right, it was a contradiction. It is a series of contradictions that would only be undone when a conservative politician called David Cameron promised to be continuity Blair in 2010. So there was something amazingly appealing about Britain shaking off its traditional politics, which were largely conservative, and the profile that was. And so New Labour, if it is coming to its end, you have to credit it. What Mandelson did, building it with Blair and a guy called Alistair Campbell, who was the communications chief in Downing Street, put across something that people found irresistible. And it was, but it's shown now that it doesn't. It's hurt people. It really has hurt people. It's confused them. It's made them angry, and the society is, I would argue, irreparably divided.
But as you were speaking, Simon, I was writing some notes here. One of the things that I did write down was cool Britannia, because you're quite right. You know, I lived in the UK. I've been visiting the UK several times a year for the last 30 years. And every time I come back, it feels more divided, certainly in the last 10 years, more divided, more depressed, more angry. And, you know, I will say, and I think the seeds of that, you're quite right, were planted by Blair and the changes that he put in, you know, changes the House of Lords, the Supreme Court. These are new things demolishing centuries old institutions. And for what? For now to usher in this kind of this low growth woke economy. And I will say, Blair, very smart man. I mean, because he managed to do all this, remain in power. We had good economic growth. There was this cool Britannia element. There was a sort of a self-confidence that hadn't quite been eroded. Now Britain has lost its self-confidence. It doesn't know what it's about anymore. And I think you're quite right. Those were sort of ushered in by Blair. The one thing I will say is I think it's a great pity that this is the thing that might bring down Starmer, because there are a dozen other things I think more substantial than Mandelson's friends that should have destroyed this. I mean, looking at the Chagos Islands alone is something that he should have been run out of town and never spoken to again for that kind of betrayal of not just of Britain, but of Britain's allies. So, I'm sorry I'm not sorry for Starmer at all, but I'm sorry that this is, if he does go, that this is what takes him out, because there are much more important reasons to get rid of this loser.
I suppose, but that the mistake, it's always the mistake. You take a set of established and tested ideas built on a sound and proven set of ideologies, and under pressure, short-term pressure to be popular, you pervert them, introducing impossible contradictions. And the momentum of what you've inherited from the previous generations carries you for a time until the consequence of those contradictions starts to cause the economy on the one hand and the society on the other to begin to crumble under the weight of the contradictions. And this has perhaps taken 20 years here. But I think that's exactly what we are seeing. And when you went there, I thought I'm eventually going to try and take this here to what James said about the DA now and the ideological clarity and the pressure that it's going to be put under. That the pressure to be popular, abandon tried and tested sets of ideas that work with proven ideologies behind them is ultimately the most fatal political thing that a party or political leader can do. And this is such a good case study now of exactly that.
Yeah, can I just make one? I just wanted to make one final point on this for our audience.
Yes,
is that when I think that the point can't be emphasized enough. Keir Starmer was Peter Mandelson's, not his directly, but through Morgan McSweeney, who was Peter Mandelson's. Peter Mandelson has played one of the most influential roles that I have ever witnessed in politics, certainly in my lifetime, and I think my fellow panelists too. Nobody has been around, nobody has survived as many scandals as he has, scandals that would have ended our careers were we in that position. He's found a way back in, as I said, always emerging stronger than previously. And, I think to James and I, we previously spoke on this guy called Zach Polanski, who's now on the very, very far left of UK politics, more so than Jeremy Corbyn. And if you look at a by-election that is scheduled for the 26th of February in a ward of Manchester, you'll see that there are two parties that are contesting that, and that's Reform and that's Green. Conservatives aren't really featuring, and Labour, after this scandal and where it's going, possibly they don't look to. The public are instinctively now going against Blair's own theory that you win elections from the centre, that there is a right choice and that there is a left choice. And my instinct here is that one of those two parties are going to prevail, and the uniparty consensus in Labour and the Conservatives in Westminster is going to be dealt a blow from which I'm not sure how it will respond.
The man running for reform is called Matt Goodwin, and if our listeners don't know, you should follow him. He's a very interesting pollster and political analyst who is worth following him on Twitter or whatever, on X. Interesting to see. Can I give it one tiny little example of what's going on in Britain? This comes from a friend of mine who's a barrister who specializes in intellectual property law. And for many, many years, for decades, the United Kingdom was a place that had very good intellectual property courts. It had judges that understood the technical issues of patents and trademarks very well. And those judges tended to be appointed by them, by their peers. They selected barristers and other legal experts who would understand intellectual property very well. And it really formed the basis of this incredibly strong legal intellectual property system in the United Kingdom, so that people from all over the world would fight intellectual property cases in London. One of the Blair changes that he ushered in was to change the way in which judges were appointed, so that they were much more represented, not based on their knowledge of the law or on scientific issues that are important for intellectual property or other matters, but so that they would reflect, race and gender more, so that you'd have more representativity. What's happened is a deterioration in the kind of judicial rulings you get in intellectual property, and a debasing of that really kind of crucial part of the law. So that's another legacy that people might not be aware of. The way that it's had this corrosive effect on a really important institution in the United Kingdom.
Well, good. Thank you, Richard. I am going to move on to a really interesting story at the intersection of the ANC and Iran. So, as we know, the ANC has ideologically been allied with Iran historically, and Iran is now facing the largest internal dissent that it has in years, and it's seriously oppressing the Iranian protesters. And what has come to light now, which is interesting information that France has, is that there is a faction within the ANC which are Christian conservatives that are totally misaligned with the ANC's stance, and it's creating some internal turmoil. So, France, over to you on this development.
Churches have always been important in South African politics, and black Christian churches particularly so. And as South Africa's Iran ties became more fraternal and friendly, one of the contradictions we began to watch is how does the ANC pull that off in the government while keeping the black Christian churches on board? Because this is a fundamental contradiction, particularly in Southern Africa now. If you don't follow closely the sort of displacement of ISIS out of the Middle East, or the taking root in Southern Africa of Islamist groups and actions and activities that I've seen some Southern African countries record terror threat index scores that are higher than the old Middle Eastern staples. And there's been some chatter around of these ANC leaders, so it isn't ordinary people, ANC leadership that's a bit at odds with the Iran policy, given its ties to global terror groups and then the threat to Christians. And in the recent past, that's began to you picked up a bit of it here and a little bit of it there, and that's began to crystallize. And it appears now that there is crystallizing a group called leaders, so people of some influence, who have become decidedly uncomfortable with continuous news streams, continuous news flows of their party's association with radical Islamist groups. and who are very uncomfortable with this, and not just for the political reasons. And in fact, the idea is in the main, it is they feel they cannot balance this against their Christian faith. And we think this is real. This is a thing now. And it's a very important thing, because if it is true, it does mean that there's a very important body now of pressure within the ANC side of South Africa's political divide that would look at walking back the Iran question. And that's important because it's one of the key conditions that the United States is looking for in order to clear the way to a vast new trade and investment pact with South Africa. So ultimately, this thing we were watching, how do they pull it off? Ultimately, it appears to have manifested. I think it will be quite an important influence on South Africa's foreign policy orientation over the next 2 or 3 years, particularly after the ANC's next leadership transition, which is set for December of 2027.
Frans, do you have any read on how strong this faction is within the ANC and if whether they have any sort of sway to influence foreign policy?
Well, I think certainly it's appeared, and certainly it's no longer disparate. I think it's crystallized to an extent. And so it's definitely on the up. And given its linkage to churches and their political influence, potentially this could be vastly influential.
Any questions from the audience or from the panelists?
No, I mean, I'll just say if the ANC, if there are elements within the ANC who can push back against this, bring it on. The evidence is becoming increasingly clear where South Africa, if it wants to reform itself as once again a moral leader in the world, then let's hope that those Christian leaders prevail. One of the reasons for my absence, my long absence, was I was out in New Zealand and Australia, and I was out in Sydney just before a couple of weeks ago, when there was I heard this noise outside the Airbnb, and it was this massive march, an Iranian march, a pro-Iranian, anti-Islamic Republic march. It was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, filled with women and children peacefully marching, calling for the protection of the human rights, for the Australian government to do something, and filled with not just Iranians and Persians, but Jews, and lots of Israeli flags too, and entirely peaceful, surrounded by police who just made sure that and I just joined the march. I went along with them. Compare that with what was happening yesterday in Melbourne and Sydney with the because of the crime that the Israeli president had visited Australia. The violent marches, the destruction, the bays for violence and murder. This has always been clear. The ANC could always have chosen to align itself with the good and against bad, but they chose not to, and I hope that this comes to pass.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that for France, and this is from the UK again. I used to run around Hyde Park, and the Islamic Republic's embassy is adjacent to the road. I forget temporarily what it's called, but at least the Royal Albert Hall, sort of on one of the borders. And there was a stand there that was occupied by the resistance against the Iranians resisting the Islamic Republic of Iran. And those guys got attacked. They got really badly assaulted. And I think this happened around June or July last year. And these are the guys that the ANC sides with. These are thugs. They're thugs living in the UK who attack their fellow citizens for what was just peacefully protesting. I think it's quite interesting that the UK government didn't do anything. Well, the UK government doesn't do anything about that. But these are the people that we apparently like and befriend.
Yeah, I've always thought, sensed that the ANC has not sided with Iran. That if you talk about the larger ANC, the family, the members, bulk of the leadership, but that there was a siding with Iran that occurred on their behalf. that they haven't been entirely comfortable with that, and that discomfort appears to be coming to the fore.
Thank you, Franz. Richard, did you want to say something?
Well, it suddenly occurred to me to alert people to the foul Tucker Carlson, whose ties to Qatar have been increasingly exposed, who came out recently talking about how Christians are oppressed in Israel and that their numbers are falling. This is absolute nonsense. Anybody who could spend 3 seconds on the internet could see that actually Christian populations in Israel have increased and are thriving. And he claims that it is Israel and the Jews that are oppressing Christians. And at the same time, he has dismissed and downplayed the Islamic attacks against Christians in Nigeria. So, these the falsehoods are coming thick and fast from all quarters. And let's hope that the truth prevails once.
Thanks, Richard. That's truly fascinating. I had no idea that Carlson was pushing that narrative in Israel. Go ahead, Franz.
Richard's mentioned Qatar twice. Qatar is very interesting, and its influence operations. You've mentioned it twice. I think it needs additional comment to explain. Why did you mention Qatar twice today?
Because they spend a fortune. For many, many years, they've been spending billions of dollars around the world, influencing media, influencing institutions, spending vast amounts on universities all over the world, funding the poisoning of minds. And these are Islamists who have enormous influence, and they have it across the board, Republican and Democrat in the United States and across the board everywhere. This is a phenomenally influential and successful influence operation. People within Trump's own administration have been on the Qatar payroll. So it's worth pointing it out. I understand, Qatar is officially kind of an ally of the United States. There are US military bases in Qatar, but these are people who do not wish us well. And I said, by us, I mean those of us who believe and want to uphold Western civilization. So I have nothing more else to say than that, Franz. That this is, just a very successful influence operation.
Just to show people the extent of it, didn't Qatar at one stage sponsor the congressional baseball game in the United States at the same time that was sponsoring Hamas?
It wouldn't surprise me.
I believe it
They're
did.
very successful.
Simultaneously.
Yes.
And it's on the left and the right, which is where your
on the left and the right
often become important. Yeah, it's not just on the left.
And hosts Hamas. Where was the Hamas leadership during the 7th October war? They were singing and dancing in Qatar, celebrating the rape and murder and torture of innocent civilians. So the common sense has its work cut out for it to go up against these people.
Well, yeah.
France, I've given it a Google. They indeed did sponsor the congressional baseball game. So,
yes.
Okay. I'm going to move on to energy and energy policy. France, did you have something you wanted to say first?
Yeah, this week is Thursday of this week is South Africa's State of the Nation address, where Mr. Ramaphosa will appear. We think we know what he's going to say. The reforms are making progress. We've got a ratings upgrade and got off the Financial Action Task Force grey list and hosted a successful G20, and the growth forecast is up a bit. And the thing to watch very closely around that will be the question of energy, which is, I think, becoming a increasing question mark over the future of the GNU. If South Africa wants to get its unemployment rate down from the official just over 30% to, let's say, 10%, and if it wants to do that over a generation, let's say 20 years, it needs to get the rate of economic growth up to around between 4 and 5%. And to do that, we calculate based on the relationship between growth and megawatts of both South Africa and other emerging markets, and factoring in questions of AI and the like, that it needs to get its daily energy production up from, would have averaged about 25,000 megawatts at a peak hour of a peak day sometime last year, to nearer 40,000. And if it fails to do that, I mean, it's one of these kind of definitive indicators to watch. Then, regardless of whether the GNU holds and if Jordan Hill-Lewis is successful and Patrice Motsepe is elected as the ANC leader and democracy is maintained, we're not going to, as a country, deal with the unemployment question. And then the prospects of much longer term destabilization into the deep 2030s and so on become serious. And the only way out of that continues to appear to be, certainly in the sort of next decade, to refit South Africa's ailing coal fleet. There's more than enough capacity available standing defunct in the veld that with a bit of refurbishment, if that's a word, refurbing, it's probably safer, could get us there. And more than that, that there is sufficient grid capacity connected to those old coal stations to ferry that energy from chiefly the north of the country into the south where the major cities are and industry. But there continues to be considerable pushback against that idea. And I mean, this has obviously been raised with government. And in the SONA address, if people ask me, what should you watch for in SONA? I think you should watch energy. And if South Africa continues stressing a kind of Euro greening with windmills and solar panels, it means that the message hasn't sunk in, that energy is going to become, even if the politics is sorted out, a major bottleneck standing between the country's stability and success and prosperity and whatever the alternative to that is going to be. And that in that sense, it's not just an economic issue anymore, it's a question of political stability and survival, and beyond that, a moral question. That until the correct energy decisions are made, the 20 million people that need a job but don't have one, and if you don't get the energy output up to the requisite levels, that's not going to change. And then deep out into the next decade, the question of whether South Africa holds as a democratic and unitary state really becomes actually quite an important question, and one that would be difficult to answer.
No, I just to go back to my segment, I think this is both a vulnerability for the DA and also an opportunity. I mean, the vulnerability is they sort of look to the West and, you know, it's fashionable to starve yourself of cheap and reliable power in pursuit of this utopian project. And you think, well, they must know what they're doing and we must go along with that. And so, you know, in the long term, this will discredit any party who pushes the sort of closure of reliable, you know, cheap power stations in South Africa and, you know, as France has documented. So the sort of opportunity is, if this is one way I think you could probably differentiate yourself from that element of the ANC that is being sucked into that clean energy transition sort of ideology. That if you become the party emphasizing, you know, that our priorities have to be cheap, reliable and plentiful, you know, power before we make any other moves, that can, you know, differentiate you certainly from a faction in the ANC that is going sort of down that route, and as France says, with potentially very, very negative consequences for the country.
Yeah, let me just jump in and say, you know, James is right. People look to the West, but they should look further west than Western Europe and look to the United States, because just this week, the United States is making it official. We've spoken before on this podcast about the endangerment finding, and people can look back and look up what that means. But basically, this is getting rid of this idea that burning fossil fuels endangers public health. This was an Obama-era ruling that set into play all sorts of very harmful climate rules and regulations, and this is now going out. And if anybody's looking, France is quite right to raise the moral issues here. This is a moral issue, and denying the use of fossil fuels to uplift the poor is profoundly, deeply immoral. It is you are requiring the poor to pay an incredibly heavy price to achieve nothing. You will achieve nothing in doing so. And all you're doing is putting enormous costs on the poorest and most vulnerable. Our current energy secretary, Chris Wright, he gave a speech recently talking about the Trump administration energy policies. And this is my favorite part of the Trump administration. As you know, I'm critical of some parts of the Trump administration. When it comes to energy, you have nothing but high praise. And he says, yes, we have indeed raised global atmospheric CO2 concentration by 50% in the process of more than doubling human life expectancy, lifting millions of the world's citizens out of grinding poverty, launching modern medicine, telecommunications, planes, trains, and automobiles too. So this is a moral good, and the ANC must wake up to this, and so must the DA. And if they're worried about this, you can look throughout the Obama administration, everyone had their panties in a twist about the social cost of carbon, just how much socially it costs to every ton of carbon that is emitted. And this was all sort of flim-flam and a game that you could, a sort of a mathematical game that you could twist any way you wanted. Richard Toll is probably one of the world's leading environmental economists. And he measures that the social cost of carbon is actually, there's a social benefit of carbon of $400 per ton because of the benefits that arise from using fossil fuels, exactly as Chris Wright, our brilliant energy secretary, explains, and how this lifts humanity up. So go for it, South Africa. Stop burning coal.
Thank you, Richard. We spoke earlier, and I think you stated it very well, and that you said that should the US revoke this endangerment policy, it would take the winds out of the sails of climate alarmism, which I thought was very well said when we spoke. And so, yeah, clearly an economy like South Africa will not be able to industrialize to its fullest capacity on green energy. And I follow the private equity space in Africa quite closely. And I consistently see green energy deals coming from Europe for Africa. They sort of put all their development finance into building solar panels and wind farms, which is just a totally incorrect approach. And
yes, and it's nice for Simon's friends in Parktown North who have their nice dinner parties. They love this idea, but they're not the ones trying to get clean water.
No, it's a pity. It's a pity, I was going to say, the ANC hasn't found a way to get on well with Donald Trump. Because he'd have supported them on this. They need this to get back to power. They need to do the call.
Absolutely.
But they're under the influence of Western climate ideology. I mean, it's very ironic if you think about it, that the ANC is bottlenecking its own prospects of political recovery by remaining under the influence of Western climate ideologues, not listening, I can tell you, to the advice from Russia or China, and certainly not taking advantage of the support they would have from Trump in America to actually, and that would be more than moral support, would be direct support to get the coal infrastructure up and running again.
Exactly. It's like they looked at Greta Thunberg, this very peculiar little strange Swedish girl who started out trying to stop everybody from burning fossil fuels and now has turned to hating Jews. And it's like the ANC, the leadership at least, not the ANC people, have thought, oh, we'll follow her instead of actually doing something decent.
But I think then in the last couple of minutes, what I would like to turn to is the trade pact that South Africa and China will be entering into. So, Frans, over to you, just an explanation of what this pact is and how this will be beneficial or perhaps not beneficial to South Africa.
Well, I think it will be very beneficial. The South Africans have been in Beijing. They've struck a framework pact, which means a set of ideas, given themselves a deadline of March to put some detail to it that will allow, on the one hand, South African firms easier access to the Chinese economy. And then the really interesting question to begin to watch is Chinese firms easier access to the South African economy. But the South Africans, in their framing of it, had a little line in that they will do so, I can't remember the line exactly, with a view to protecting domestic industry. Now, that's the critical contradiction to watch here. because greater entry for Chinese firms into South Africa's economy will bring with it much more competition from very brilliant corporate leaders with an astonishing work ethic, amazing technological abilities, and very low levels of tolerance for the kind of bureaucratic obstacles that are put up in front of industry and investors in South Africa as a general rule. And it's interesting that South Africa's business, formal business sector and community, which is very Western oriented, it's historically been the case because of who colonized us, that they've been very lukewarm in their reception of the Chinese investment pact, the details of which must still be thrashed out. And I think privately the ANC realizes that it's doing ideologically what it kind of thinks it should do, stand with the BRICS grouping against the West, but in practice is very afraid of the consequences. And we spoke a bit about ironies today. We saw a nice irony on that a few weeks back when South Africa's Trade Ministry thought to tariff the imports of Chinese vehicles, which are threatening the market dominance of Western auto manufacturers in South Africa. And so you have this amazing irony where South Africa stands on the global stage talking up BRICS and saying the global South will stand together to fight the dominance of the West. And then in practice signs up, puts tariffs on Chinese firms to protect Western firms in SA. Same time of starting to strike a new Chinese investment pact with a rider that the pact mustn't be allowed to threaten domestic industry. We think the further Chinese entry into the South African economy will be a very good thing because it will bring with it a sort of ruthless competition, determination, vast volumes of which are sorely needed to begin to break some of the old historic monopolies that continue to exist in the South African sort of broader economic space. And then also with the pact in hand, the South Africans need to go back to Washington. They need to send a single person who's a serious guy, not work through layers of old-fashioned diplomatic channels. He needs a mandate. He needs a plan in his pocket. Point 1 in the plan should say, minerals, you need those. This is what we can do for you. And point 2 should be energy. We need that. This is what you can do for us. And beyond that, infrastructure and the like, back that up with a new transatlantic pact. We can have a deal done with Washington within a...
I mean, this is seriously contrasting to the sort of failed attempts we've had with the US to get a trade pact together. So I have a question, although I might be misinformed. The Chinese currently, do they have any investment they have to make immediately when they come into South Africa, similar to BEE, rules that Western companies have to adhere to? I might be misinformed in that they perhaps don't have to comply to that. And how does that affect this?
I mean, the laws of the country apply. You're very seldom misinformed, or not at all, I think. Rainer is a storied Washington operative in certain respects. No, the laws of the country apply to everyone, but I think are met with where Western firms might have sought to accommodate these rules and embrace their justifications. I think non-Western firms and entities perhaps have a lower level of tolerance for that, for which reason the entry of more non-Western competitors into the South African economy might turn out to be an interesting catalyst for policy reform within the country. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think this is a really good place to conclude, unless our panel has any final thoughts today. Simon?
I do. Just to finish up on the end of New Labour, I want to read something. I want to finish with a quote. There's a very good man in the UK called Lord Maurice Glasman, and he is a Labour peer, and he established a group called Blue Labour. And these were people that were genuine in that as the Labour Party has mutated, these guys have stuck to them to their principles. Lord Glasman has been a huge fixture. And he's a politician who really does have gravitas and a huge following. And on Saturday, his Blue Labour released a statement, and the statement is as follows: "This week exposed the moral and intellectual rot at the heart of the Labour Party, glib arrogance, vicious court gossip, and a culture of conformity, a willingness to look the other way for factional reasons, blind to how it looks to the outside world. And for what? In the careerist scramble for a brief moment in the limelight, all imagination and curiosity are crushed, and so we are left empty of ideas and empty of soul. How far we have fallen as a party. This must be the end of New Labour."
Thank you, Simon. It's a good place to end. Ladies and gentlemen, our audience, thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Making Sense podcast from The Common Sense. I encourage you to like and subscribe, and please head over to our website to see some of the best-in-class political analysis in South Africa.